You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast and the Future Tech Health Podcast. And I have Aric Prather. He's an assistant professor in the UCSF Department of Psychiatry. He's also a faculty member in the Health Psychology postdoctoral program at the Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society postdoctoral scholars program. And he works with the UCSF Center for Obesity Assessment, Study, and Treatment. So, Aric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your work. What got you interested in obesity, and what do you do in regards to it?
So, so my work is primarily in the context of sleep and stress and how it affects health. And so, one of the ways in which that does that is it can impact kind of whether we gain weight or not. But a lot of the work that we do is really focused on trying to understand some of the underlying biological pathways through which kind of health behaviors, particularly sleep and kind of our daily lives, affect our health. And so we do a lot of work both in the lab and in the field, studying those things, as well as kind of doing a deep dive into a lot of the biological mechanisms. One in particular is we're really interested in markers of cellular aging and trying to understand how we live our lives seem to accelerate the pace at which we age.
All right. So in terms of aging, have you identified what you think are accelerants of aging? Maybe the strongest accelerants?
Well, so of biological age, the best predictor of disease risk is chronological age, right? As we get older, we tend to get, at greater and greater risk. But it turns out that if you look at say, a 65-year-old, their risk varies a lot. And we're trying to understand some of the biological signals that happen to account for this difference. And so one of the ones that we focus a lot on is telomeres. So telomeres are on the ends of chromosomes. They cap the DNA. And as your cells divide, specifically we focus on immune cells, as they divide, those telomeres get shorter and shorter. And if they get to a critical shortness, they send the cell into either apoptosis, so cell death, or they can turn into a senescent cell. And those senescent cells kind of accumulate as we age, but they accumulate at different rates for different people. And those cells become very inflammatory, meaning that they release kind of these proteins that lead to inflammation, which we know seems to be a central driving pathway for a lot of the chronic diseases of our population. And,
right.
While there are a lot of things that contribute to that, I'm a clinical health psychologist. And so the thing that we focus on are kind of these factors in our world, like, kind of people that are under chronic stress, for instance. So we do a lot of work studying caregivers. So people that care for loved ones with dementia or parents of kids with autism. Those people are under these chronic burdens, and it's there that we see, relative to people that don't carry that same level of stress, that a lot of these biological processes are sped up or exaggerated so that it contributes to aging at the cellular level.
Well, what do you see being sped up? What constitutes aging at the cellular level? Just telomeres shortening faster than normal? What else? I would bet it's a whole host of things.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different things that you can look at. One of them that we focus on is telomere length, but certainly the accumulation of cells, immune cells that are turning senescent. So there are, this is particularly true of T cells, and so we look for T cells that lose a marker that seems to be really important, one called CD28, and another marker that seems to be gained when cells become senescent. So it's called a CD57. And so we'll track those over time. We'll track how T cells change over time. And then there's kind of like, if you look at gene expression, there's lots of different pathways that you can begin to look at. And we think that kind of if we, in a given individual, if all of those things seem to add up, those are the ones that are put at the highest risk. And this is not just risk for, chronic diseases, but infectious disease too. So we do, a fair amount of work in the laboratory trying to understand behaviors, particularly, I'm interested in sleep, that seems to really put people at increased susceptibility for infectious risk. And so one of the ways that we've tested that is actually measure people's sleep and then expose them to a virus and see if in fact they get sick. Another way that we've done this is giving people vaccinations, and so looking at stress or sleep and seeing that predicts how people respond to these vaccinations. And one of the ways that seems to matter is if you have more of these aged cells, your immune system just doesn't respond as well. And so it's part of the story. But with science, we're kind of always peeling the onion to try to understand all of the different things that may contribute to our health and well-being.
Well, what about the whole cascade of events that cause a cell to act differently? Have you identified the start of the cascade, the end of it, the steps?
Well, so we're like a behavioral immunology lab, and so we're kind of always kind of looking at different aspects of it. But because we do things in humans and we do things, we're really interested in trying to develop interventions. Our work isn't focused on kind of the basic science, say in kind of single cell organisms or of any of those those model systems to really get at those types of things. And so what we do is we kind of track the literature and are always integrating other various levels of biological assessment to begin to tie those pieces together. And so as I mentioned, there's kind of various genetic processes that seem to be contributing to for instance in telomere length. We study the enzyme telomerase, which is what is important for putting the telomeres back on, and seems to play a role in lots of different aspects of biology. We study this so-called longevity hormone called clotho, and that seems to be related to kind of inflammation and oxidative damage and all of these things. And so we really are just trying to collect more and more information. But what you're talking about is kind of this step-by-step stuff that we don't tend to do just because that's not our area of interest or expertise. We work a lot with basic scientists and immunology labs, but as a psychologist, that really isn't kind of where my plan is. Of course, it's really to figure out how we can improve some of these things and whether they do in fact have a downstream effect on health.
Well, since you're a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, what is the psychology of it? Where are you looking at that aspect of it?
So psychology, right? So I'm trying to understand some of the impacts of stress. How do people experience stress? Kind of what emotional processes might drive variation in some of these things. So I'm a clinical health psychologist, and so I do both clinical work, kind of helping people who are under chronic stress, as well as treat people with insomnia, and then try to develop new interventions. And so all of those things can fall under the realm of psychology. And so it's really about measuring human behavior in a way that helps us gain some insights into kind of the variation that contributes to some of these biological outcomes, so that we can do a better job of developing tools for individuals or for policies to kind of improve the health and well-being of a population.
So, so the stress response is what you study. I guess, lack of sleep, lack of sleep and then exposure to a virus, that kind of thing. But what are what are the first steps in the stress response biologically? And, are you studying those and what's happening there? Like, how does a stress response turn into, early senescence of cells, for instance?
Sure. I mean, so, it's certainly complicated, of course, and there's kind of like a wear and tear on the system. In the laboratory, if we actually expose someone to an acute stressor, we're able to track kind of, immediate changes in the sympathetic nervous system, as well as, a little delayed responses in, say, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the output of cortisol. And then we're also able to kind of track the dynamics of some of these other biological processes. So kind of gene expression related to inflammatory genes and the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and see what those dynamics look like. And the notion is that if individuals are exposed to acute stressors over and over and over and are not recovering appropriately, that causes a wear and tear on the system. And so, we're able to track some of those things with the tools that we have. But, and certainly this has been enriched by some, work in social neuroscience and those things, where they're able to look in the brain specifically and different areas of the brain that may drive sympathetic arousal. We know that, sympathetic outflows can impact bone marrow and changes in cell distribution that may be as a result. And that's some of the work that we're kind of getting into now, more experimentally. But, we have these kind of models that we've been working with, and the tools that are at our disposal for humans are not quite as, granular as you could do with, say, an animal model of sorts. But, that being said, there's, good evidence that, the increased activation of the sympathetic nervous system, for instance, accounts for some of the, at least, distribution or functional changes in the immune system in humans. And so we know that because you can do kind of blockade studies, right? You can pharmacologically block the sympathetic outflows and see if that removes some of the changes that we see downstream in the immune system. And that's work that was done, now like 30 years ago, but still kind of seminal work to help us understand how all these things fit together.
You mentioned gene expression. Have you seen that being exposed to stressors, acute stressors over and over and over? Do you think it changes your gene expression? Do you think it affects you permanently in that way?
So there are a number of studies now that have looked, using kind of microarray or RNA-seq technology, where they look at, say, people that are under chronic stress and people that aren't. And they do see, fairly consistent patterns where inflammatory genes are upregulated, genes implicated in viral, protection are downregulated, genes that are related to cortisol production and kind of anti-inflammatory processes are also downregulated. And so at least in those studies, it's been fairly consistent that it's kind of a tip towards kind of increased inflammation and a downregulation of things that are thought to be protective. And that's in some ways why we think that people that are under chronic stress tend to get these chronic inflammatory conditions more readily than people who aren't. And so that's one way of looking at it. And whether it's like that forever, it's hard to say. Those studies are not done. There are very few kind of longitudinal chronic stress studies that have used those types of techniques or kind of obtained the biology that would help us answer that question. We've done a number of different intervention studies in chronically stressed caregivers, and we do sometimes find that some of these things that we see at the beginning kind of go away and potentially the inference would be that it's in response to the intervention. But those trials are really hard to do well, and it's the honest truth is that it's much easier to disrupt the system than it is to improve it. And that's one of the challenges that most people find in these health psychology studies.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I just wonder if you've identified the point at which stress becomes a permanent condition, a permanent effect on the body, and when it's reversible. I mean, effectively reversible.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think stress is firstly it's adaptive in a lot of ways, right? So stress acutely, can increase motivation. It has important, effects on metabolism that are critical for survival, right? Like if you didn't have the stress response, we wouldn't survive. The problem is that it's turned on in the wrong times. It's turned on too often, and we think that there's wear and tear. And so, I don't think we have a good sense of kind of at what point there's no point of return biologically. Certainly, as we age, things get harder because our just system isn't repaired in the same way, and so that's certainly part of it. But I think from a psychological perspective, we're always trying to understand kind of what attributes of an individual seem to create some of these kind of ongoing stress responses, right? So one of the things that seems to be problematic for individuals that are experiencing a lot of stressors are things like kind of being someone who ruminates, right? That kind of like always relives these experiences, and that can actually lead to prolonged stress responses. One of the things that is, interesting though, that's coming up in the literature more and more is the negative impacts of things like early life adversity or trauma in childhood, where in that instance, for some reasons not well understood yet, those seem to imprint the individual biologically that does carry on. And so it could be that there's this sensitive period. There's a lot of people working on kind of trying to understand the epigenetics of early life adversity. And so, that's an instance where if someone is exposed to something, in childhood, that does seem to carry on, and whether that's because it impacts them directly biologically and that's carried forward, or an alternative is that, that changes the way that people interact with the world, and they're more threat sensitive, and they there's a tendency for people that have experienced early life adversity to view kind of neutral, ambiguous stimuli as threatening. And so if that is the case, then it could be that that it's ongoing because people are just like seeing the world as more stressful. But it's a really interesting time to be doing this work because all this literature is coming out, and kind of we're gaining more and more biological tools to really see how these things get under the skin.
Yeah, and I guess people that are in the military, for instance, are exposed to conflict or things like that, even when they're older, and develop, PTSD. Perhaps they've changed epigenetically too. And I don't know. Then there's the question of whether these changes are heritable or not. I don't know if you've looked into that or if there's any literature that talks about it or not.
Which thing being heritable? Like, what do you mean?
Let's say you're traumatized as a child and you're a stressed out person. You essentially have PTSD from being abused as a kid, and then you have children. Your children have they inherited your stressed out way of being? Is it heritable? Some of these epigenetic changes. I wonder if there's any literature on that or not.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is certainly some interest in kind of like transgenerational stress. But that instance that you're talking about, it's a little hard to pin down, only because unless you have kind of an adoption study of some sort, right? That because individuals that are experiencing kind of post-traumatic stress, it's possible that their behaviors are different in child rearing, for instance, that could lead to kind of variation in anxiety levels and things like that among kids. But it's certainly there's some animal data to suggest that stressing a rodent while they are pregnant can certainly kind of impact the disposition and the biological trajectory of the pup. And so, I mean, I think that's a really interesting idea that could be kind of sussed out a little bit in the literature, I think.
Well, what kind of unusual or interesting or strange things have you seen through your research or through your review of the literature? What things really pique your curiosity or you think are fascinating or amazing in regards to stress and aging?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, the work that I do is really kind of at the intersection of sleep and stress, and so I do a lot of work trying to understand kind of that bidirectional relationship and thinking about what so often people in say the stress field or in the sleep medicine field kind of focus on kind of either the daytime experience or the nighttime experience, but of course it's more of a 24-hour existence, and so and they're so intimately tied to one another and provide opportunities for kind of studying these reciprocal processes and opportunities for like two different interventions. You can treat on individual stress, or you can actually treat their sleep complaints and may get spillover in either direction. And so that I find that really exciting. And one thing that we've been really interested in is trying to understand, and document the extent to which, an individual's lack of sleep changes the way in which they experience the world and actually either select into more stressful experiences or they perceive the world as more stressful, and what is the kind of biological cost of that. We certainly live in a society where people are getting insufficient sleep. And I think all of us have the experience of kind of a day where we get dramatically less sleep, and we may notice things about the way we deal with things emotionally or cognitively, and we think that has like an important effect on how you biologically respond to stressors. And so in a study that we just completed, we found that in these high stress mothers and kind of low stress mothers who were followed over 3 weeks time and kind of completed a sleep diary and had their sleep measured objectively using wrist actigraphy, and completed a stress diary every night about kind of what was the thing that was most stressful to you. We found that people who got less sleep than they typically did, and it wasn't say just the short sleepers that got like 5 hours of sleep or 4 hours of sleep. It was just less than your average. The following day, they were much more likely to experience higher levels of stress when they kind of reported on the thing that they found stressful. What was really interesting, though, was that these diaries that we had them fill out, these stress diaries, we had individuals kind of write down exactly what it was that was stressful to them. And then we had expert coders kind of, verify that, in fact, the thing that they wrote down would be seen as stressful in the general population, that everyone would agree that was stressful or not stressful. And so they were able to kind of group these things into kind of minor hassles and kind of actual real stressors. And what we found was that, one, it didn't matter if you were a high-stress caregiver or a low-stress control person, a parent, of course, is all stressful, that didn't seem to matter. But the impact of sleep really just seemed to increase people's stress response to low, modest things, that sleep didn't seem to be important if you had a real stressor that happened to you. Everybody felt more stressed then, but it was these kind of like minor hassles where people reported higher levels of stress than you would have expected because they got less sleep. And so, it really did speak to this idea that it kind of changes our perspective and our perceptions when we get less sleep than we typically do. And so, and the other thing that was really interesting of this is that when people got less sleep, they were more likely to also have more stressful things happen to them the next day when they were coded. So with the idea that people, like stressors aren't just randomly distributed. There is some kind of tendency for, say, people to, if they're under periods of less sleep, they are more likely to get into conflicts with people at work or with their partner, or, certainly you can think of like accidents and all those things. They're considered stressors, and they happen as a function of the amount of sleep that an individual is getting. And so our next step in this work, since we know that there are some people that when they have short sleep, they actually, experience more stress. They may be more sensitive sleep stress sensitive, we're now trying to understand whether they look different biologically. So if this is something that happens a lot, if this is like a trait-like thing for them, does it seem to promote some of these kind of age-related processes that we think are so important for health? And we're just getting into this data, but it does seem to look like to us that people that have this happening, this when they get less sleep, they do feel more stressed. If we look at composites of different biological outcomes, they do seem to look worse. And so we're trying to kind of carefully characterize people, but we think this sleep, it's not just about your sleep and it's not just about your stress, but it's about how those things are tied together that may put someone on a negative age-related trajectory. And so for me, that's really exciting because it's kind of pulling all these pieces together.
I mean, from what I've experienced is the better you feel, the better your relationships will be, the better a person you'll be to your husband, your wife, your children. If you feel like crap, of course you're going to lash out, and it's going to lead to more stressful situations because you don't feel good. When you don't feel good, you tend to not be a very nice person. So it makes total sense that would happen, And I know some people are more predisposed to be stressed out versus not, and have things affect them. Some are more sanguine. So all that stuff definitely makes sense,
Yeah, I know. It's a funny thing that happens with this type of work that we do. People are like so I do all this work on like when people get too much not enough sleep, they end up getting sick more, right? And it's like, well, didn't we know that? But it turned out that there wasn't that much empirical data to support those types of ideas, and so it requires this kind of careful assessment to really kind of drive home the point, but also to affect policy, right? I mean, you need the actual empirical evidence to make changes in some of the things that we do, and so that's why we do this work.
Well, any surprises? Does it only take a very small amount of sleep disruption to really get sick a lot easier than before? Or what surprises have lay in these? There's things people could say are obvious, and you're right. Now we have empirical data to back it up. But what were some of the things again that were really surprising to you?
I guess I'm always surprised that the findings are so consistent. It's one of those things that it's one of the things that's been so surprising to me that in all the studies that we've done, when we measure sleep, for instance, we measure lots of different aspects of sleep. Like we measure people's, subjective quality. We measure kind of how fragmented it is, how long it takes people to go to sleep, how many times they wake up. And then we measure how much sleep they actually get, the duration. And no matter in any instance, it's always the amount that they get. And that's not to say that how fragmented it is doesn't matter, because it does sometimes, but more often than not, it's the amount that they get. And then when we look at kind of what that looks like how much is enough, it's always around 7 hours. But if people get at least 7 hours of sleep, they tend to be fine. What's interesting is that, we're learning, I work with some geneticists here at UCSF, and, we're starting to understand some of the genes around kind of sleep need and people that are, habitual short sleepers where they need very little sleep and how that's genetically driven. And so the hope is that we can begin to kind of at the right level of scale, try to understand some of those things, and so that it's not always the case that people need 7 hours, but it is just so consistent. And although that is not the most flashy answer, it is certainly something that has surprised me every time.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Aric, what's the best way for folks to learn more and to see more of the specifics on what you're working on and to get in touch?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always welcome for people to contact me, and so you can certainly do that from the UCSF website, or you can follow me at Aric Prather on Twitter, or just look me up, Aric Prather.
That's great, Aric. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.